Okay, so today's lesson is about identity. Identity is a very complex topic with lots of different opinions and lots of moving definitions. And so, our goal is not to define exactly what is or is an identity, but more to come to an understanding of the different terminology that we use when talking about identity. So, these are just some of the terms we're going to go over. Um, just please keep in mind that when we're talking about identity, it's a very personal subject, and it's in a constant state of change, a constant state of flux. So the definitions and terminology about identity change, and they change in real time, right? There's always a debate about the different terms that we use when speaking about ourselves. And so for every definition you find, there's probably an alternative definition in existence about that. Identity politics is a very real thing that our society in particular definitely grapples with and debates constantly. However, it's important to talk about identity, and it's important to come to an understanding of some of these terms in order to help us better understand how we define ourselves, how we see ourselves, and the terms that we use when speaking about who we are. So, the first term we're going to talk about is culture, and culture is it's a very abstract concept. It's almost a moving target, if you will. So, a basic definition for culture is a shared system of learned values, beliefs, and customs that dictate how people behave and interact with one another. Um, this is constantly changing. The nature of culture is change. And there's many different reasons for that, and there's many different types and classifications. So you have music culture, you have school culture, business culture, video game culture, right? Anything that a group or community has decided this is how we're going to interact, right? That is the building of a culture. And the reason why it shifts and changes constantly and is basically because of time. Time changes everything. And culture is no different. So if you think about American culture of the 1920s, right, it's very different than American culture in 2020. So our focus, just to narrow it down, will be about our communities, our families, ethnicities, and our social culture. So keep in mind when we talk about culture that not everyone knows everything about their own culture, right? Like, oh, you're XYZ, so you should know everything about XYZ. This is false. They should not be expected to know everything about their own culture. And then nobody embodies completely all of the different parts and aspects attributed to a particular culture. Um, you can have and be part of multiple different cultural groups. Culture does help shape and definitely impacts everybody's personal identity, but it is not the sum of their identity. Okay, culture does not define any one person. When we talk about culture, we also want to make sure that we understand what the term dominant culture means. So it's just the predominant culture in any given area that sets the standard of cultural correctness. So it's basically just the majority, right? So in the United States, in America, the dominant culture is American culture. In Mexico, the dominant culture in Mexico is Mexican culture. Now, of course, these are vastly simplified um, expressions of culture and dominant culture because it really does depend on where you go and what part of the country, what region, etc. So there are a lot of nuances when we talk about dominant culture. But for our terms today, just know that the majority in a localized area makes up the dominant culture. Also, instead of just thinking of it in national terms, right, we also have these ideas of Western culture, which is attributed to the United States and sort of European type cultures. And then if you hear like Asian culture, Obviously, that's an allusion to Asian countries and their sort of shared beliefs and interactions. Obviously, like vastly different countries will have different cultures, but when we talk about dominant cultures, sometimes they're referred to in regions. But again, culture is a shared systems of learned values and beliefs and customs. So keep that in mind when we talk about culture. I would be remiss if we did not also talk about subculture and what that means. So they're basically groups that are under or fall underneath a dominant culture, but are distinct and different enough to merit their own designation. So some examples of some subcultures in the United States that have existed were the hippies, bikers, skaters, people who cosplay, video gamers. They all have their unique, different subculture that is different enough from dominant culture. However, when a subculture becomes popular enough and is adopted by enough of mainstream culture, then they can be absorbed into dominant culture and no longer have the subculture designation. So again, I want you to keep thinking of culture as something that is always shifting, always changing, always reinventing itself. Okay, so the next term we're going to look at is ethnicity. So ethnicity is categorized by descent, right? So basically your genealogy, your ancestry, that's going to determine your ethnicity. So for example, I identify ethnically as Mexican and Japanese because my father is Mexican from Mexico, my mother is Japanese from Japan. So ethnically speaking, those are my two identities. So again, it's just your ancestry, your background, your origins. Now, a term that is usually used often interchangeably with ethnicity is the word race, but that would be an incorrect term to use when speaking about your ethnic background, because race is simply a way of categorizing people solely based on their physical characteristics, such as skin color, facial features, or hair, height. It's not based on any type of biological or genealogical categorization. So it ignores all of the background information. People of mixed races, of mixed ethnicities, are often designated by their most prominent feature when it comes to race categorization. So, for example, Tiger Woods, he's half Asian, 1/4 white, 1/8 Native American, and 1/8 African American, but is often referred to as just Black. So, race is not about all of the different things that make up who Tiger Woods is. It's what does he look like the most, because then that's the one that he will be designated, right? I am half Mexican, half Japanese, but my Asian features are much more prominent than my Mexican features. So in a racial categorization, I would be considered Asian. So when we talk about nationality, this is the status that you obtain usually by the location of where you were born, or where your parents were born or hold citizenship to. Typically can only be one national of one country, but that is ultimately defined by the laws of that country. It's also very similar to citizenship, and oftentimes those two terms are used interchangeably, and there isn't a lot that separates them. Citizenship can be changed, and you can obtain citizenship to different countries, again, depending on the country's laws. Multiple citizenship is possible. And it's not solely defined by location of birth. So you can have citizenship in a country if you, like, for instance, you can become a US citizen by going through the process or whatever various means, and not have been born here, right? But nationality, typically that comes from birth. Your nationality is defined either by you being born in a particular place or your parents being born in a particular place. both nationality and citizenships have very heavy political connotations and are subject to international and domestic laws. So all of these things combined, right? Ethnicity, race, nationality, citizenship, culture, they all sort of work together to answer the question of who am I? Who are you? It's a complex mixture of the internal and external elements from our everyday life, from our political identifications and our personal identifications. So, some internal elements that help you define identity can include things that you like, things that you don't like, your self-esteem, how you see yourself, your sexual orientation, your interactions with other people. And then external elements include the people around you, right? Your culture, the culture that you're in or that is surrounding you, the economics, the opportunities and interactions, all of your experiences, a lot of things that you can't control that you're just a part of. So again, all of these things really kind of work together to create this identity and this person that you are and how you see the world and how you make sense of it. Oops. So identity is something that changes pretty often. At least I like to think so. And it's really ultimately up to you to decide, right, what parts of your heritage, your culture, your background that you want to make a part of who you are as a person. No one thing defines you. So to better understand how these complex terms sort of work together, we're going to watch two different TED Talks. One about The Power of Diversity Within Yourself by Rebecca Huang, and then one by Michael Rain, What It's Like to Be a Child of Immigrants. There will be a short questionnaire that you have to answer. And then ultimately, I hope this gets us thinking about who you are as a person. I want you to start thinking about what is your perception of your cultural identity, and in what ways do you feel you reflect your cultural identity in your personal identity, and in what ways do they differ? Right? So do you see yourself as being a big, like, is your cultural identity a big part of you, or is it just a part but not the biggest part? And again, I know this is all very complex and a lot of different definitions. So if you have questions, please feel free to reach out, email me, hit me up on GroupMe, whatever you need. Yeah, well, I hope this helps.